It's my pleasure to introduce Vincent Leggett, who's going to give a talk tonight titled Historically Black Beaches of Southern Maryland and African-American Ties to the History and Culture of the Chesapeake Region. Mr. Leggett is an educator, author, and founder and president of Blacks of the Chesapeake Foundation. I have entered that into the chat here for anyone who is interested in visiting their website. He's devoted decades to documenting the contributions of African Americans to the history and culture of the Chesapeake Bay. Tonight, Mr. Leggett will recount the legacy of African Americans in the region and of the historically Black beaches in Southern Maryland. So, Mr. Leggett, thank you for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you. You've just been a gracious host, and we've communicated every step of the way. I'm just excited to interact with our viewing and listening audience to just share with you some of my experiences over the last 30 years in documenting the contributions that African Americans have made to the maritime and seafood processing industry. The Blacks of the Chesapeake began as a personal project in 1984, telling the stories of African American men, women, about their experiences, how their lives were shaped by the Bay, and just the passion of that body of work and just the treasures that I discovered in those early beginnings led me on a 30-year path, continuing to share those stories. We have written books and curriculum guides and produced music, recorded music, oral histories. We have a 30-year local legacy collection that's currently being processed in the Maryland State Archives that contains over 40,000 images, VHS tapes, cassette tapes, many documentary films, material records, artifacts, and so forth. And our goal is to continue to process this body of work so it will be available to scholars and researchers and teachers and students. And as the sea level rises, due to climate change and the landscape has constantly been vanishing, so has the people. I guess 30 years ago, many of our informants were 70 years of age 30 years ago when we asked them to tell their stories about what was it like in the fishing industries, fishing and crabbing along the Chesapeake Bay. When we asked them about their experiences in the boat building industries, working in the various industrial concerns around the Bay as it related to the maritime and seafood industry, as well as the historical images and opportunities that they were involved in. And as we dug more and more into those stories, we just became more and more fascinated with their experiences, but not only their celebrations, but also learn more about their disappointments. That through this work, Blacks of the Chesapeake, I've had an opportunity to travel in the deep end of the Bay as well as the shallow end of the Bay, working with people in thriving communities as well as working with individuals in struggling communities. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to give more than we take, try to leave people better than we found them. But also, one constant theme to all of our experiences has been that there's dignity in all work. And so if you're individuals who's was shucking oysters or picking crabs or working on the middle deck in mud and shells on a oyster dredge boat, we wanted to hear what your story has been. And so often a recurring message that we have received from people in all walks of life is, it's not how much you make, but it's what you do with what you make. And some people that have had a livelihood on the Bay have sent some of their kids to some of the finest colleges and universities this country has. Today has been a very exciting day for me. I spent the early part of the day on Maryland Eastern Shore, just looking at the work of Harriet Tubman on the Chesapeake Bay and how her life was shaped by the Bay. And we had a group that were looking at some early archaeological sites that had information pertaining to her early beginnings on the shore. And so that was just so profound. as we were on one of these archaeological digs, I had a feeling that I was either on a moon launch or going through a safari. I mean, just with all of the phragmites, and these are invasive grasses that are invading our seashore. But in the 1830s and 1850s, where Harriet walked, you could go right up to the water's edge. The whole night story is going to be about water. And as Greg and his team indicated, we'll be talking about African American beaches. I know of some are official beaches, some are unofficial beaches. And so I hope that as the night goes on, if you have your own stories about beaches that you have attended, some may be lesser known than others. Please share those with us. But two of the beaches that a lot of my work has been involved with are Cars and Sparrows beaches. For tonight's lecture, I'm going to put Anne Arundel County in the southern Maryland swing because the lower part of Anne Arundel does connect with Colbert County down through Friendship, Rose Haven, lower southern Anne Arundel County. But Cars and Sparrows beaches were the largest African American beaches on the Chesapeake Bay. Cars and Sparrows beaches started in the 1920s and operated up until the 1970s, right in Annapolis, Maryland. One of the things that made these beaches so distinctive is the stars and entertainers that came to these beaches. People like James Brown and Little Richard and blues man John Lee Hooker, the Temptations, the Supremes, and these kind of organizations frequented the beaches, and they were part of a whole underground culture called the Chitlin Circuit. And this is when African American musicians and comedians just toured the United States. And my talk tonight is going to be around the Eastern Seaboard, where they would start up in the New England states and work all the way down to Florida, and then even over to the Gulf Coast, sharing their music. And I don't know if any of the viewing audiences saw the movie The Green Book. It just talked about places during the 40s and 50s that it was safe for African Americans to travel, because you have to remember this was going through a period of segregation in the United States. And even with many of the beaches, the African American beaches, the reason that they came about was because African Americans and some others weren't allowed to go to majority facilities. And therefore, the whole phenomena of African American beaches came into existence. But these two beaches I'll start with are Cars and Sparrows. They were started by two African American women in the 30s, Elizabeth Carr and Florence Carr Sparrows. Their father deeded them over 100 acres on the Chesapeake Bay. He acquired the land in the 1920s, over 100 acres, eventually divided between two daughters. One established Sparrows Beach, and what they would say was Sparrows Beach was more family oriented for church groups, swimming lessons, community societies, and assemblies. And the sister beach, which was right next door, was owned by Miss Elizabeth Carr, and she had a bandstand that could handle over 7,000 or 8,000 people under the bandstand. And a popular radio disc jockey, Hoppy Adams, and he worked on AM radio 1190 AM, and it was carrying 50,000 watts. I mean, they were broadcasting out to West Virginia, all of Eastern Shore, all of Southern Maryland, part of Delaware. They would be doing advertisement for cigarettes, beer, anything else. And he had a program called Sunday Night Bandstand on the Bay. And that's when all the stars would come to Annapolis. Again, I'll go back to this concept of the Chitlin Circuit, because many of the entertainers would be at the Royal Theater in Baltimore or the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C. Primarily, the beach resorts operated from Memorial Day to Labor Day. And so, again, that's when people were heading to the water's edge. But even heading down the Gold Coast of the Chesapeake into the Brandywine area, they had Wilmer's Park. And again, this was an 88 acre complex in the greater Brandywine area where Baltimore, Washington, D.C., with Baltimore connections, owned a restaurant over in Washington, D.C., acquired 80 acres in the mid 50s, 1940s and above, and had hotels and swimming and music. And so these same entertainers that would leave a Royal Theater in Baltimore, a Cars and Sparrows Beach in Annapolis, a Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., and they would come to Wilmer's Park down in Brandywine. And so, again, these are just showing how African Americans and other minorities, in spite of rules and laws that determine who could go where and when, they still tried to provide recreation and seaside entertainment to people that were seeking some respite from the sun, some respite from the workplace. But what I would also say about these waterfront properties is that the role of the African American watermen. I know the majority of my research has been in the greater Annapolis area, but I also know that whether it was further down on the Maryland Eastern Shore, uh, there were other beaches in that area. In some of my work, when I was going down through St. Mary's County, Vince Briscoe had a campground, and uh, 30 years ago, I would stop by there and people came in with RVs and picnic tables. And so again, when just people just talking about the peacefulness that comes along the water's edge, and that's one of the things that I think these beaches really provided people an opportunity to step away from the concrete and the asphalt and just find an opportunity to interact with the environment, movie, food, music. And one of the things that I've really found interesting and have done several different talks on, and I would like to hear more of what your experiences were, no matter what your culture is. When you went to the beach, what food did you bring? Did you bring your chicken? Did you bring your crab cakes? Did you bring your hard-boiled eggs? Did you have watermelon? One of the many stories that I've found is even coming to Cars and Sparrows Beach and even talking about my family that came from North Carolina, and my aunts would have chicken, fried chicken, wrapped up in shoe boxes with string tied around it. They would have a shoe box full of pineapple upside down cake with a string tied around it, a shoe box full of chocolate cake with string tied around it. And so I hope that members of our viewing and listening audiences, as they interact with the night's program and share about their experiences on the beach, and some of the places may be well known, others may just be private places that may not have had neon signs, may not have had stars that came, but it was a place for family to get together around a meal, families to get together, sing songs together, play cards, whatever you did to entertain yourself at the beaches, the parks, and other resorts along the Chesapeake Bay. One thing I think that in Southern Maryland, and I have worked with one professor, Charles Diggs. He was down in the La Plata area, and he was one of the earlier mentors for me. And he would just refer to the Patuxent River and the Potomac River as just the ancient rivers that have been around for over 12,000 years. And even the Chesapeake being the largest estuary in North America, and just looking at how the Chesapeake Bay has been utilized for uh, commerce, for trade, and all kind of military pursuits. Even in some of my research, it goes back to the battle between the Americans and the British in 1776, and I've had an opportunity to portray an enslaved person, Charles Ball. He fought in the War of 1812, and I've done reenactments of his story. He was a Chesapeake Bay waterman and joined Commodore Joshua Barney's Chesapeake Flotilla. And when they had the battle, this is the Americans and the British, had the battle at Bladensburg, and then when they had the battle in Washington, D.C., and then they turned to Fort McHenry in Baltimore, people like Charles Ball. And the reason I lift up Mr. Ball is that so many of his pursuits are on the water's edge. But then also, when I look at the Potomac River and just look at how all of these major water bodies fed into the Chesapeake Bay, and how tobacco, and I know just from my own family's experience in the Carolinas, tobacco was a cash crop. But even things like tobacco were transported on the water's edge. But the whole thing tonight is about water and just the role that water plays in our culture, water plays in our society. I'm working on a number of projects in the Baltimore area, Maryland Eastern Shore earlier today, just looking at the whole intersection of African American and indigenous communities, whether they are federally recognized tribes or federations or state recognized. But again, just looking at how people use the waters of the Bay, the waters of Southern Maryland. And so what I really hope tonight is to just provide you an overview of the Blacks of the Chesapeake, a little bit about myself. I describe myself as a country boy from East Baltimore. And once you stop laughing and say it's nothing country in East Baltimore, I'll explain to you what I mean is that both of my parents migrated in the 50s from North Carolina. My mother came from the greater Rocky Mount area. My dad came from Fayetteville in area South Lumberton, North Carolina, and those things, and migrated to the city, just looking for a better life, looking for work opportunities. But a big part of my growing up was every chance we got together, family would come together. It was something about gathering along the water's edge. In many cases, it was a peacefulness came with that experience. And so again, I'm just trying to, as they say, prime the pump, and hopefully I might say something that might spark a question in your mind that you may share, or you might have some information different from mine, or even a different perspective than I've shared tonight. And so I've asked Greg and Deborah and the team on that end just to see if there are any questions from the audience, from the viewing and listening audience. I hope you can tell my passion about the subject, and I can speak to it for a straight 45 minutes and not even take a breath. But I really get my joy from interacting with the audiences, having these talks being stakeholder driven. And so again, weigh in, raise your hand, put a note in chat. We can start some dialogue, Greg, and then I can just share additional information that some of our audiences may want some finer points on. So, Greg, I'm going to take a breath at this moment. I don't know if we have any traffic generating in the chat box, or whether you, Deborah, or anyone else on your team has anything that you all like to share with me or raise a question. And let's just kind of open up a little bit and get some more voices into tonight's story.
Okay. Deb has raised her hand, so go ahead.
Okay, so my question is this. I know there's a beach down, historically Black beach down here was in Calvert County called Seagull Beach. And I've heard several people just like mention it when I've talked to them at the park, but I don't really know anything more about it. So I've driven by a road called Seagull Beach Road off 231. So I'm wondering if anybody can elaborate on Seagull Beach.
Well, one thing, I've talked to a lot of the guys over in Annapolis that had a hand in Cars Beach, and they also had a hand in organizing Seagull Beach. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they talked about, they said they had one of the best piers anywhere. I mean, I've never seen pictures of Seagull's Beach, but the signature of it was just such a beautiful, sturdy pier. People would come by boat and by car and by horse and by wagon. And so, again, it was a hot spot on the Chesapeake Bay. And again, let's identify that, maybe do some oral histories, see who else might have some images or histories about Seagull's Beach. But I know that there was an Annapolis connection, and everybody always talked about the pier there. And again, your listening and viewing audience may have other information, but that's what I know about Seagull Beach. But also, I know that I've done work down in Windmill Shores and Longview, also down there, Maddox Road and other places going further down Route 4, Route 5, that were also waterfront hotspots. Many of them were summer homes for doctor, lawyer, Indian chiefs from Baltimore and Washington. They can even afford a summer home. And over time, when they brought in more water, sewer, upgraded facilities, these communities have gone through transition. But again, it's these communities that might not have been formally referred to as a beach, but they had waterfront access. And I was always fascinated with the Windmill Shores and the Longview because my dad, my uncles would fish on the Wacomico River. And I was just so fascinated that there was a Wacomico River on the eastern shore and a Wacomico River on the western shore down near Salisbury on the eastern shore. And so to have two Wacomico rivers, and they again are indigenous Native American names, have just always piqued my interest. And so again, we've added Seagull Beach. I made reference to Windmill Shores and Longview, also water privileged communities up and down the bay. Many of our friends, my wife's family is from the Wasons Corner, Lothian, Mount Zion area, kind of going down 408 Route 2. Eventually, you'll go down into Colbert County and Solomons and across the Thomas Bridge and so forth. But again, they would just talk about places along those routes where they would kind of gather up and just try to find some water to dangle their toes in, put a fishing rod in, or just enjoy the abundance of waterfront in Anne Arundel County, Southern Anne Arundel County, and the state of Maryland. So again, other people can weigh in and share some of their stories, but let's put a pin in Seagull Beach as an area that we can swing back to and continue to build a record and some old histories and things around Seagull Beach. Thank you for mentioning that beach.
Okay, Tricia?
Thank you so much, Mr. Leggett, for joining us tonight. This is a topic I've been interested in for a long time. I have a comment and then a question. So I've been poking around in the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper quite a bit, the late 19th and early 20th century. And it looks like churches would actually rent these steamships to take them down to to beaches, for day and evening type events. And so, some of the newspaper articles have, really beautiful woodcuts of these steamships that could be rented to take people out of the city and get them out to the beaches. My question is about the Chitlin circuit. Do you have a sense of whether the folks that were performing, were they top 40 stars yet, or were they just sort of starting out and not quite as famous as they got later? And, how did these little family-owned beaches afford these really fabulous acts? Thank you.
Things. People like James Brown were stars. Little Richard was a star. I would say people like Ray Charles and Little Stevie Wonder and the Temptations and those things. And what I would say is that even with a Carr's Beach that was open from the 1920s to the 1970s, and let's say that James Brown might have came in the late 50s or 60s, it was only a quarter to get in the beach. A hot dog couldn't be much more than a nickel. And so I just had to keep in perspective what was the cost to get into the facilities where they're performing at. I think also because the restrictions and the payolas and royalties and so forth. And I think that just the expenses of going on the road. So I would say that not a lot of money changed hands, even from interviews I've done with stars, that if you have a hit record out, whether you were Lloyd Price, for example, he was a hot ticket over on the Eastern Shore. He had Eastern Shore connections. the Sam Cooke, the Ray Charles, the Marvelettes, the Ruth Browns. And so there were some performers that had hit records out on the charts. They can build more money. But in order to build a show during that time, you had to have lesser names and rising stars. So I think that was a real big part of it. And also, when it came to the demise of the segregated beaches, because so often people of color could not go to majority beaches, that when they had an opportunity after civil rights reforms and so forth to go to other places, they took advantage of it. And even when the singers and the stars and the musicians had a chance to go to other venues and make money, those two factors collided on each other. And so I would surmise that not a lot of money took place. And part of what undergirded the chitlin circuit was you were just trying to make enough money to make it to the next stop on the circuit. I mean, some of these people had 10 and 12 piece bands, everybody had to be paid. So that's my initial take. Going back to the steamers, it was one captain in the 1920s, Captain George Brown out of Baltimore. He owned a steamship that could carry 2,500 people, owned a park outside of Baltimore called Brown's Grove outside the mouth of the Patapsco River. And so not only did he own his own park, Brown's Grove, on the Patapsco River, owned a steamship boat that could handle 2,500 people. And so again, that level of enterprise did exist on the Chesapeake Bay. And so continue your research. I think you're on a hot trail. Look up Captain George Brown, and I think he'll be an excellent example of the points that you were making.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Michael Cantus raised his hand, and he also put something in the chat. I guess I will leave you to handle both of those. Thanks.
Okay.
They're pretty much the same thing. I did research Seagull Beach. Seagull Beach was on the river here. One of my cousins, Alan Brown, who's passed away, he played in the house band there. And so he gave me firsthand information on that. They were called the Hounds. And they were on the Chitlin circuit. They had James Brown, they had Wilson Pickett, they had other acts like that in the early 1960s. And like a lot of the they had the sundown laws over on the bay, on the Chesapeake Beach and North Beach, that blacks couldn't be there after 5 o'clock or sundown, which is one of the reasons they started the Seagull Beach. So it was actually the Goldstein family, Louis Goldstein's family, that owned a lot of property on the water. And they owned Seagull Beach and leased it out. They let blacks manage that property. They also owned the property that ended up being Camp Mohawk, which is an all-black kids camp on the river farther north in Huntingtown. So they saw money in leasing property or selling property to blacks long before others did. And that's how we had access to the water during that time.
Well, Mike, I'm glad that you tapped in, my friend. I mean, your family has a rich legacy. Salt water is running through your veins also, my friend. And just thank you for your advocacy and your steadfastness over the years. Continue to try to lift up the stories and shed light on the cracks and crevices of the African American story in your region and throughout the state. And thank you, sir. But yes, and I think one common connector was whether that was Carr's Beach or Rivers Bend that was down in Wason's Corner. That's kind of heading down you guys' way as well. Seagull Beach and many other places. You can imagine with a James Brown with 10,000 people, a Little Richard, a Bo Diddley, all of these people that perform on the Chitlin circuit. Security was a key aspect. And a George Phelps in Annapolis had created a special deputy sheriff's security division that really had African Americans that had law enforcement power on the premises where you had the gatherings of these beaches that to handle crowd control, parking, a little unrowdiness, a little bit every now and then, but something to assure the stars that came there that somebody was in charge. Again, they were talking about they had one show down in Annapolis where Jerry Butler was performing, and the people didn't pay him his money in advance because so often these stars would come to these venues and not be paid. So Jerry Butler was insisting that he was going to be paid before he came in, and they almost turned his car over. And he came out, sang, and got his money after the show. So again, having the George Phelps special deputy covered Seagull Beach, because that was one of my sources about the Seagull Beach, the special deputies. And again, they played a key role in many of these African-American beaches, juke joints, or other dance and gambling halls around the Chesapeake Bay. But thanks, Mike, for your input there.
Okay, next we have a question from Andrea Banks.
Yes. Good evening. I don't. My question has to do with. I came on about 10 minutes ago. My question has to do with whether or not you mentioned Highland Beach. Now, granted, that was a community where people from DC and various business people had summer homes. But my question is, did they ever open up their community for some of the Chitlin Circus circuit performers to come to? Like there's Columbia Beach also. Was it Columbia Beach? Yes, Columbia Beach, as well as Highland Beach.
Well, let me just start with Columbia Beach for our viewing and listening audience that may not be familiar with it. Highland Beach was started by Frederick Douglass's son, the Frederick Douglass's son, because he tried to go to Bay Ridge, which was an all-white segregated beach, and was turned away. And he went across the creek. There were African Americans that owned land in the area that eventually became Highland Beach. And they did establish a summer community, again, for Dr. Lawyer, Indian chiefs from primarily the Washington, D.C. area. What I would say, and from my experience with reading the record and interacting with some of the elders from Highland Beach, is that it still pretty much remained more of a private community. It is the second incorporated town in Anne Arundel County with their own mayor, commissioning, taxing district. So my experience is that most of their functions were private. Whether it's the Paul Laurence Dunbars or other luminaries, professors from Howard University, Lincoln University, that would come down, and I think they fashioned themselves as much as a literary society with Murray Church Terrell and other leaders in early education in Washington, D.C., that kind of populated that area. So I would say by being an incorporated town with a mayor and commissioners and their own taxing district, that they really treated Highland Beach in a much more private fashion. The home that Frederick Douglass designed but never lived long enough to live in is currently called Twin Oaks, which is a museum of the history of Frederick Douglass and of the early beginnings of Highland Beach. It's by appointment only, but it's just a fabulous community, a fabulous waterfront, great people. It's a great cultural and heritage center. And so I guess with COVID, the last 18 months, everybody's been pretty much shuttered in place and sheltering in place. But I think it is a great place to email, Google, call, and get an opportunity to experience that. The adjacent community, and I live in that same stretch of the Chesapeake where you have Highland Beach, Arundel on the Bay, is a waterfront community that I live in. And again, at one point it was predominantly white, had tennis matches, a train ran down to the beach. And then in the late 40s and 50s and 60s, it became a predominantly African American community, and now it's a community in transition. And so again, just as a lot of the summer homes get converted to year round, sewer comes in, tax and assessments go higher, the elders pass on, the next generation doesn't have a great interest in it. So many of these communities are in transition. And Oyster Harbor is another African American enclave that's right in that part of the Chesapeake Bay and the greater Annapolis area that has a similar demographics and trending in the same direction. Let me just step down a little further on the southern Anne Arundel County coast to Columbia Beach.
Yes.
I'm currently working on a project looking at urban heritage of Columbia Beach that was, again, primarily, this is in the greater Shadyside area in southern Anne Arundel County that was founded in 1940, 1942. Al Jones and other names, but they had Joe Louis that came and hung out down there. He would come from Baltimore. Joe Louis, the prize fighter, the African American world champ, had a fight in Baltimore. He came down to Carr's Beach and put on a boxing exhibition. I mean, and that was unheard of during the time. But to get away from the crowd, he went a frill a little down the coast, down to Columbia Beach, where he could get some rest, eat some fried fish, and put his feet up on the rail. And so even as I looked at some of the historical records in Columbia Beach, names like Joe Louis, names like Duke Ellington, names like Ella Fitzgerald, names like Cab Calloway, they came to a Columbia Beach, but they were looking for more of a laid back, get off of the chicken circuit. They don't need the crowd. They were mainly staying with family and friends and contemporaries of theirs because even quality hotels during that period didn't exist. So many of them found lodge in the holdovers in private homes in places like Columbia Beach. But that's a community that had boat races on the Chesapeake Bay. They had beauty contests on the Chesapeake Bay. They have a memorial chapel, an outdoor service that I recently had an opportunity to speak at and participate every summer from May to September. They would have an outdoor non-denominational service, and it was more inspirational than preaching, but just being on the water's edge, and we would have a nice meal following the inspirational talk. So again, just trying to share with you and the viewing and listening audiences just ways that these waterfront communities, whether they were a beach, a lake, a cove, a park, just provided opportunities for people to enjoy the bounty of the bay and the catch of the day, and also talk about the hope for tomorrow. But thank you for lifting up those communities, and hopefully I added something to it, but we can continue to research and build on and share. But thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions or any more comments? Oh, we have a question that just popped up in the chat. It says, did the appearance of unsegregated beaches in the 1960s and 1970s contribute to the decline of private Black beaches?
Well, I think a couple of things that contributed to the decline of it. Anytime you have wooden buildings on low ground, salt water, salt air, unless you have a lot of money to continue to upgrade those facilities, they just deteriorate over time. I mean, even with the case of, I'll say, the famed Sparrows and Carr's Beach, once the civil rights laws shifted and people of color had opportunities to go to Bay Ridge and even a Sandy Point. Some of your viewing audience might have heard the name Sandy Point. I mean, this is a state-owned park on the western shore, western side of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, that our family came down from Baltimore to Sandy Park, but there was a colored section of Sandy Point State Park and a white section of Sandy State Park, and the facilities were not equivalent. So it wasn't a separate but equal, it was a separate and unequal. And so when my family had an opportunity to say, well, hey, we had enough of walking through sewage. I mean, nothing was draining anywhere on these low bottom lands. We started going to Bay Ridge that had a swimming pool, a diving board, and the beach, and a tree grove. And so I think that one part of it, the physical plants just couldn't hold up. I think another part is the price of waterfront land and the taxes. And then it became more fashionable to be on the water's edge. So I think it's a number of issues that collided on a way of life. And even the stars could make more money now going to Vegas, going to Miami. I mean, a lot of the big stars started playing in bigger houses, making bigger money. So I just think a number of things converged on a way of life.
Okay. Additional questions? Well, it looks like that is all we have. Do you have any? Go ahead.
I don't know where the hand raised thing is, so I'm just going to ask a question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What do you think was the primary motivation for the segregated facilities at Sandy Point?
So I think that the state law itself, I mean, it wasn't arbitrary. It was a state facility, but it was a state law that was just promoting the whole separate but equal. And until advocates through the NAACP and other organizations, the Thurgood Marshalls and others just began to argue legally against open accommodations, whether swimming pools, the beaches, the lunch counters, the transportation systems. I think they were all blanketed in the same kind of restrictive legislation. And so until they had changes in that restrictive legislation, because it was the law, so it wasn't like they had Beverly Treaton Beach and Mayo Beach, and even here in Anne Arundel, they were all kind of private beaches. But to have a government sanctioned beach that still had a race code, that was very hard to overcome. But it was really through the laws, courts, and legislation that over time that gradually changed. And I just think it was a lot of concern about race mixing, a lot of misconceptions about people, and just a lot of prejudice wrapped around those issues. And some of that prejudice was directed toward color, but also other ethnic groups that I've interacted with that also face challenges and restrictions to access to these kinds of facilities. I know that down in the greater Shadyside area, some of the Hebrew people had to have their own special sporting clubs and boating clubs and gunning clubs where they felt free to enjoy their history, their culture, enjoying the Chesapeake Bay, because in some facilities, they were disinvited as well. And so through my research and interacting, there have been several ethnic groups around the Chesapeake Bay that weren't allowed to go into majority recreational facilities. And so they created a space and a place of their own to celebrate their history and culture and heritage.
Okay.
Well, Greg, can I make my closing argument then?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Well, what I would just say, ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, thank you for this opportunity to share with you some of my research, some of my experience about African-American life on the Chesapeake Bay. A key part of the work we do is trying to reach out to the next generation to not only share the history and legacy of African Americans on the Chesapeake Bay, but try to point them to a way up and out, looking at careers, looking at STEM, science, technology, education, and STEAM, the arts and mathematics, and just looking at all the various careers. We're doing a project that's talking about climate justice. I mean, obviously people here have concerns about the water's edge, and another part of the Blacks of the Chesapeake is advocacy. So just looking at the whole impact of climate change. And what we have found is in many African American communities, the whole concept of climate change just doesn't resonate. When if the whole point is saving the fish for the fish's sake or saving a tree for the tree's sake, when people inside the Baltimore beltways, inside the DC beltways look at the challenges facing their community, housing, healthcare, equal justice, education, these greeny looking and sounding issues fall way down to the bottom of the list. But when you look at issues like environmental justice, when you look at the disproportionate placement of landfills and transfer stations and where do the trash trucks park at night and legacy metals and factories and things, some of the challenges up in the Baltimore Harbor where people are fishing and the fish are coming out of the bay glowing. There's so much mercury and toxins in it. And people will say, well, Mr. Vincent, we aren't eating the fish. And I say, well, you really might need to put some gloves on to handle the fish, but I know you are eating them. And these are kind of classic environmental justice issues. And so we're working on a project that's combining climate justice and sea level rise and environmental justice. And again, just trying to look at the impact of sea level rise, climate change, and just trying to get more of our community engaged, more of the community engaged on how to improve the quality of the Chesapeake Bay and not have it so overshadowed with a lot of scientific terms. Because if you walk into a 7-Eleven on Martin Luther King Boulevard anywhere in America and ask people, do you want clean water? We say yes. Do you want clean air? We say yes. Do you want safe places to raise your kids? We say yes. Well, those are the environmental issues. And so we try to smash the myth that people of color don't care about the environment. It's how the information is framed. But even so, ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, we use our collective history and culture to show that we've been boat builders on the bay, owners of seafood processors on the bay, owners of recreation boating clubs, yacht clubs, that we've been involved in all aspects of the Chesapeake Bay, seafood and maritime industry. I bet our stories have not been told. And so we're trying to lift our stories up and let everyone know that this bay is your bay, this bay is our bay, this bay is all of our bay. Because so often when I work with school kids, they look at our noble Chesapeake Bay just as a playground for the rich. And they might not come in contact with the Patuxent River or the Potomac River or the Patapsco River or the Atlantic Ocean or the Chesapeake Bay and said, that place is not for me. But once they know that they have a vested interest in the history and the culture, and it is a celebrated vested interest in the history and the culture of the Bay, perhaps that might make them take more of a hand in it, but also show the economic impact. And so that's just not for the third grader. It's also for the postdoctorate. It's also for the state senator, the state delegate, and the U.S. congressman that we have to teach the people. And so I just say on that note, Jeff Pack Group, thank you for giving me an opportunity to share some of my experience, strength, and hope tonight. But my head is to the sky. We're taking a step forward. And just to be over in Harriet Tubman country earlier today, just looking at places that she walked, the bay, the river, the historians, the archaeology that's being discovered now about her early beginnings, her family farm, her mom, her dad, how she used the bay and the tributaries to spirit enslaved people to freedom. And then the other bookend to Harriet Tubman is Frederick Douglass. And he stood on the banks of that noble bay and said, this bay shall yet bear me to freedom. And I just use those words as inspiration to myself to continue to show up and suit up and reach out and like we're doing tonight. So Greg and your team, audience, thank you all for allowing me to share, and hopefully I've lifted your spirits just a little bit more. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the talk. That was great. It was wonderful to meet you virtually anyway, and thank you for giving us your time. I think everyone here enjoyed the talk. I do have a few closing comments real quick. Thank everyone who joined us. I do want to mention that the Friends of Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum they're the group that makes all of this possible, and so many other things that we do at the park. So if you're interested in finding out about our Friends group and about the things that they do, you can visit www.friendsofjppm.com. I put that in the chat. And I will also plug our talk next month. We have Aaron Dieter Wolf, a prehistoric archaeologist from the Tennessee Division of Archaeology, discussing the archaeology of tattooing in North America and beyond. The talk will be held at JPPM on September 30th at 7 p.m. So again, Mr. Leggett, thank you. That was wonderful. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.
All right, Deb, I think you have to end the recording, right?
Yeah, I've been pushing the end recording button and I'm having trouble getting it to respond. I'm trying a couple of different things. It's just, I don't know why it's not responding.
Because it's technology, it always does the worst thing at the worst possible time.
Yeah, and it's the easiest thing to control is just toggle on and off, but I'm having trouble. So anyway, Vincent, thank you so much. It was super interesting. And I like the fact that a lot of what I heard tonight was material that I didn't hear you present on when you talked at Cirque. So just very interesting. You have like a tremendous personality that comes through even on the screen. So very, very enjoyable and touching, really. So,
well, I look forward to working with you guys down there with the underwater archaeology. I was with Dr. Julie Jabinski earlier today over on the shore, and she's part of the family as well, and Park Service, NOAA, EPA. I knew you have some information down there about Charles Ball down there.
Yeah, we definitely do. Yeah.
I've done reenactments at Sodley Plantation at the museum. So I would like to kind of circle back a few guys and give you an update on what the Blacks of the Chesapeake are doing and who some of our partners are, and just look at ways to do more collaborative work with you all.
Yeah, very, very open to that. And I want to tell you, I hope you don't mind, but I passed your name on to the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in Baltimore. Have you been working with them on projects at all?
Right. I did an oral history project, and we've worked together on and off, and, just trying to get the leadership to stabilize a little bit. I kind of get going with one director, and then 18 months, I got a new director I'm being introduced to. And so we have the new lady that just came in from the Memphis Civil Rights Museum. And so everybody's in transition, but they are a key resource. Do have contacts and connections there. I know they want to freshen their inaugural Waterman's exhibit, and I served as a trainer for their docents. Open up. And so again, everybody's just kind of been shattered over the last 18 months and just trying to pivot to a different space. But thanks for passing the name along. I look forward to collaborating.